Good evening. Welcome, everyone. My name is Tracy Stewart. I serve as the interim provost here at the University of Scranton, and it is my delight to welcome you this evening to the Ignatian Values in Action lecture. And it is further my honor to welcome back Father Greg Boyle of the Society of Jesus. Father Boyle is the founder of Homeboy Industries in Los Angeles, the largest gang intervention, rehabilitation, and reentry program in the world. A beloved author and speaker, Father Boyle is the recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the California Peace Prize, and the Latari Medal from the University of Notre Dame, amongst many awards and accolades that he's been given. The title of his most recent book, our common read, Whispers and Screams, Cherish Belonging, The Healing Power of Love in Divided Times. I could spend a lot of time telling you how his words move me, but you're not here to listen to me. So I will close with two passages from his book that I thought seemed very germane to our times. First, we need attentive hearts to make way for a universal, all-inclusive belonging. We need to step away from a Christianity that supports exclusion and superiority. It's a head-scratcher that so many Christians are frightened and rebuke the notion of woke, when the entirety of Advent is about waking up. Mark 13 alone, Jesus says it 6 times. And the other one, before I closed, is paramount for all of us at this moment, is how to forge a way out of our intractable impasses. Obstacles and hazards abound. With a cherishing love, we are still on the fastest route. So please join me in welcoming Father Boyle and homies George and Junior. George Balthazar and Junior asked me to introduce him as Junior. I want to say to them, thank you for traveling to Scranton to share your love with us.
Good evening, everyone. My name is George Balthazar, and I was born in Los Angeles, California. Life didn't wait for me to grow up. It hit me early. At 15, I left home, not because I hated it there, but because I truly felt like I was a burden to my parents. I had a baby on the way, no job, no plan, just fear and a growing desperation to figure life out on my own. The streets became my teacher, and that's where I met the homies. They gave me something I didn't even know I was searching for, a sense of belonging. For the first time in my life, I felt wanted, like I mattered. I saw how they were living, the cars, the confidence, the respect. It was all built off illegal activities, but to me, it looked like success. So when they asked if I wanted to get in the neighborhood, I didn't hesitate. I felt honored. And just like that, I was in. I dove headfirst into a lifestyle I didn't fully understand. I wanted what they had, the motion, the money, the freedom, but I didn't realize that behind all that, there was pain, loss, and prison. Before I knew it, I was in LA County Jail, facing 36 years to life. I'll never forget sitting in court, seeing my mom and my sister cry, not because they were mad at me, but because they were heartbroken. I broke their hearts. I put them on those early morning buses just to visit me for 15, maybe 30 minutes. That image, their tears, their pain, it was something I'll never forget. After 6 months of fighting my case, I took a deal, a strike and a 3-year joint suspension. I thought I got lucky, I was going home. But joint suspensions is tricky. You're out, but you're not free. One wrong move, and you serve the time you owed. A year and a half later, I caught a new case. This time they gave me 48 months. During that time, I lost friends, I lost family. My big sister died in her sleep, and I wasn't there. I needed an escape, and that's when heroin entered my life. At first, it was just something to numb the pain, but it swallowed me whole. I thought I'd use forever. I truly believed I'd never be sober again. Then came an $18,000 settlement due to a car accident, and with it, full-blown addiction. Every dollar I touched went straight to heroin. Soon I was homeless, strung out, broke, and alone. Rock bottom for me was MacArthur Park, also known as Zombieland. The first time I stepped foot there, someone handed me fentanyl, and as I sat there high and empty, I looked down at myself and thought, what am I doing here? This isn't me. I left, but I came back. That night I ran out, I was sick, tossing and turning, in withdrawal. I had a camera in my room I never checked, but that night I watched the footage. It showed my mom sitting by my bed crocheting while I was slumped over, barely conscious. I watched her get up every few minutes just to make sure I was still breathing. I saw her praying over me. It broke me. The next morning, I looked at my girlfriend who had stayed up all night watching me suffer and said, find me a detox, I'll go. She couldn't believe it, but she didn't waste a second. She found a place, and by 7 a.m. the next day, I was on my way. That night before detox was one of the hardest nights of my life. I was in the shower at least 50 times, just trying to get some relief from the pain of withdrawal, but I made it. And I didn't just complete detox, I completed 7 months of rehab, and this time it wasn't court ordered, it was me. After that, I needed structure, support, and something to keep me going. So I went to Homeboy Industries, and that's where I found my new family. Since being at Homeboys, I've been able to visit places I've never thought I'd go. I have my own apartment that I pay with clean, honest money. I get to be present in my kids' lives. I get to show up for my parents. Just 2 days ago, I celebrated my mom's 73rd birthday, and I was able to make her feel special. That meant everything to me. Most importantly, I get to use my story, this story, to influence others who might be walking the same path I once did. I want them to know it's never too late to turn your life around, and I am living proof of that. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gerardo, but Junior is more easy to pronounce. And I want to share a piece of my story with you guys. I was only 13 years old when I got put on my hood. From as far back as I can remember, I felt like a burden, like I didn't matter. Oh no, this is the wrong one. My apologies. Like I didn't matter. I didn't know how to deal with my sadness and my fear, so I drove it with anger. The tattoos came in to numb the pain I felt inside, to wear my story on my skin because I didn't know how to speak it out loud. I grew up with 2 amazing parents and a sister who loved me. But at 14, I started going in and out of juvenile hall. That's when the headaches from my parents began. Every time something good would happen or someone would try to help me, I pushed them away, not because I didn't care, but because I wasn't ready. I questioned my life thinking, I don't matter anyway, so I might as well go full gangbanging. I used drugs to numb my pain so I didn't have to feel anything. My mind became my biggest enemy. By the age of 16, my actions caught up with me. I was facing juvenile life. That's when I met Father Greg. I was a different person back then, and he got to meet a different side of me. My apologies. And I'll never forget what he told me. He's like, come to me when you're ready. So it stuck with me. Eventually, I told myself, let me try Homeboys out. That decision changed my life. There was one person I met there who understood everything I felt. Someone who genuinely wanted good for me. And it was unexpected because I thought he was my enemy. Someone who showed me brotherly love that I always was looking for, and it's George. I appreciate you a lot. Homeboy Industries gave me hope, a chance at life again, and a family I never thought I'd have today. I am a student at El Camino College now, striving for something better, a nightmare that became a dream. And now from everything I've lived through, I want to show people who feel like a burden that I see you. You're not alone. If my story tells you anything, it's this. No matter how far gone you think you are, there's always a way back. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for extending your hospitality to the three of us. They've run us ragged all day today. I'd like to blame Pat if I can, but, oh, there you are, yeah. She's so short, it's so hard sometimes. Anyway, it's been a joy to travel with you two guys, and so the day won't ever come when I have more courage, or I am more noble, or I'm closer to God than you guys. Every time I'm in front of a microphone, I always think of this homie named Luis Perez, who was kind of a force of nature. He worked at Homeboy for like 10 years. He ran the place, former heroin addict, shot caller, gang member. But he, when I couldn't give a talk, I would send him to give a talk, and he was quite good at it, and he liked doing it. And so one night we went out to dinner, just the two of us, and he was giving me tips on how to speak publicly. And he said, you gotta pepper your talk with self-defecating humor. I said, yeah, no shit, that is some good advice there. So, I look at a crowd like this and heartened by the fact that you were forced to read my book against your will. My publisher thanks you. But it always makes me think of what Martin Luther King says about church, that it's not the place you've come to, it's the place you go from. And so you go from here to hope to advance God's dream come true, which is to create a community of kinship such that God, in fact, might recognize it. And you go from here to imagine a circle of compassion, and then imagine nobody standing outside that circle. You go from here to dismantle the barriers that exclude. In fact, that's what you're being prepared for. You go from here to stand with great particularity at the margins, because that's the only way they'll ever get erased, is if you go from here and decide to stand out at them. And you stand with the poor and the powerless and the voiceless. And you stand with those whose dignity has been denied and those whose burdens are more than they can bear. And you will feel the great exquisite privilege there is in being able to stand with the easily despised and the readily left out. You will get to go from here to stand with the demonized so that the demonizing will stop, and with the disposable so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. And you will go from here and you will need to brace yourselves, because people will accuse you of wasting your time at the margins. But the prophet Jeremiah writes, "For in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing." And you'll find out that you'll go from here and other voices will get heard because of you. The truth of the matter is, none of what I've just said to you makes any damn sense if it's disconnected from the God who is spacious and expansive. A friend of mine, Mirabai Starr, who's a mystic and she translates mystics, she says, once you know the God of love, you fire all the other gods, which of course is the task of adults in their own faith journey. We want to somehow arrive at what St. Ignatius used to call the God who's always greater, more expansive and merciful than we could ask or imagine, the God who loves us without measure and without regret. And true enough, what Richard Rohr says, that yes, indeed, we are created in the image and likeness of God, but it's also true that our image of God creates us. So then you get stuck sometimes, perhaps believing in a partial God rather than holding out for this expansive one that we have. Because half the time we're projecting onto God, who we would want to be if we were God. Annie Lamott says, you've created God in your own image if God hates the same people you do. So you want to avoid that at all costs. Meister Eckhart, also a mystic but lived many hundreds of years ago, used to say, it is a lie, any talk of God that doesn't comfort you. Now, we kind of don't fully believe that because we think that somehow God is eternally disappointed. And we get stuck in that place. I remember there was a little homie named BB. We called him BB. He was little, like 14 years old. He was in my office at Homeboy, and he was making small talk. And he said, gee, have you ever won the Nobel Peace Prize? And I laughed. I said, no. And he looked at me and he said, haven't did enough? I said, yes, I suspect that's it. But we kind of believe in this God who looks at you and thinks, you haven't did enough. And that's too bad, because we're missing out on the God who can't take his eyes off of you. Many years ago, I would celebrate Mass, well, I still do, but Mass at San Fernando Juvenile Hall. It's not quite like it was in those days, but in those days, you'd be in a gym like this, and there'd be 200 gang members sitting on folding chairs, and I would be up on a raised platform, and I'd be wearing my alb and my stole, and then there'd be the ambo over here, and the homies would get up to do the readings, and they had these sheets that had the readings in English and in Spanish, and presiders sometimes, will just kind of say, I'm going to close my eyes and listen to the word being proclaimed. So I did, and I rested the sheet on my lap, and I closed my eyes, and first guy got up and read the first reading from the Hebrew Bible, and then this homie got up to do the responsorial psalm, and I don't know, there was like an overabundance of confidence in his voice, and he gets up and he says, the Lord is exhausted. And I said, what the hell? And it was, the Lord is exalted. And I remember thinking at the time, wow, that's way better. Because everybody in this room can connect to the exhausted God. You know what it's like when, like if you're of a certain age and you had the grandkids over for the weekend, and how was your weekend? Oh, I'm pooped. Well, it's a good tired. I had the grandkids, and they ran me ragged. And But you know what it is? It's about somehow resembling the generosity of God. And it is way better. You know, one of the benefits of COVID, of course, was the invention of Zoom, at least in my life. And I have 5 sisters and 2 brothers. And so we were on Zoom all the time during COVID. And then we've kept that up since. So once a month on a Sunday at 4, we gather, and with all their spouses. And so it's a lot of people. And we gathered on my mom's birthday, and it would have been her 100th birthday, but she died when she was 92. And my father had died 30 years prior. And my mom died the way, you know, you want to, in your own bed, in your own home, surrounded by your kids and your grandchildren. And she was sharp till the very end of her life. In fact, in the last year of her life, she watched so much MSNBC, she was becoming Rachel Maddow. And she was not a lick afraid of dying. I mean, in fact, a month before she died, she was just giddy and exhilarated and so excited. And she said to me, "I've never done this before," which is something you say just before skydiving. In fact, the day before she died, I was sitting at the foot of her bed, and it was all by myself in her room, which never happened. You were always a freeway. But it was just me and her, and she was asleep. And at one point, she opens her eyes, and she sees me sitting there at the foot of her bed. And she says, "Oh, for crying out loud." And she went back to sleep. Well, she was pissed that she hadn't died. I'm going, "Sorry." And then the next day, as luck would have it, again, I was there at exactly noon. I think my sisters were out trying to retrieve lunch or something. And she was asleep. And then suddenly she opened her eyes, and she lifted her head away from the pillow, and she let out this wondrous, glorious gasp. Skydiving. And she left us. And nobody in earshot of that sound could ever be afraid of death again. And I remember towards the very end, she'd be in and out of consciousness, and there were 2 or 3 or all 8 of her kids and a bunch of grandkids. And whenever she came to, she would lock on to just one of us, and she'd look at this one person, and she'd say with breathless delight, "You're here. You're here." And I remembered that, and when I buried her, I thought, I think that may well be the singular agenda item of our exhausted God, which is to look at you with breathless delight and say, "You're here. You're here." In fact, you know, you think back to Jesus in the desert, 40 days and 40 nights, which is our precursor to Lent. And I can't say the word Lent without telling you about Michelle Nunez, who was a homegirl, tough cookie from the projects, who she worked at Homeboy. And one day she came into my office, she goes, "Well, it's official. I just found out my man's been cheating on me." And I said, "Oh my God, I'm sorry to hear that." "Oh, I don't sweat it. I just went to church, got me them ashes, gave his ass up for Lent." That actually has nothing to do with what I'm telling you, but I'm like Pavlov's dog. If I say the word Lent, I have to tell you about Michelle Nunez, so. But I digress. So there's Jesus in the desert, and we have this notion of a grumbling stomach and dark night of the soul and agony and doubt, when I suspect it was probably 40 days and 40 nights of God looking at Jesus and saying with breathless delight, "You're here. You're here. And so we receive the tender glance, and then we choose to be that tender glance in the world. We notice the notice of God, and then we choose to be that notice. I have a homie who I call my spiritual director, and every morning, every single morning, at very early hour, like 3:30 in the morning, he gets up early like I do, and we read the readings and we pray about them, the readings for the day. And a couple of weeks ago, he wrote me, he ended his email, and we send little reflections back and forth. Not long, just what's your take on the readings? And he ended an email the other day by saying, so today I will surrender into the arms of the God of love, then choose to be those arms. And I think that's the whole law and the prophets. So this event in this university is not the place you've come to. It was always going to be the place you go from. And you go from here to be in the world who God is, compassionate, loving, and kind, hoping always to bridge any distance that separates us, to ensure that there is no daylight, and that we obliterate once and for all the illusion that we are separate. So Homeboy was born a long time ago, 1988, during the time I was pastor of the poorest parish in the city of Los Angeles in the diocese, Dolores Mission. And it was nestled in the middle of two public housing projects, Pico Gardens and Aliso Village. Together, they comprise the largest grouping of public housing west of the Mississippi. We had 8 gangs at war with each other, which is unheard of in housing projects. And the LAPD called my parish the place of the highest concentration of gang activity in the whole city. So if LA was the gang capital of the world, then my parish was the gang capital of Los Angeles. I buried my first young person killed because of this sadness in 1988, and 3 months ago I buried my 263rd. Not all from that parish, of course, but I know a lot of gang members. I get asked to do this. So the first thing we did was we started a school because there were so many middle school, junior high age gang member who got the boot from their home school. Nobody wanted them. So in the middle of the day, they were wreaking havoc. They were selling drugs, writing on walls. They were violent. So I walked out to them, and I would isolate them one at a time, and I'd say, hey, if I found a school that would take you, would you go? And to my surprise, every single one said, yeah, I would. And then I couldn't find a school that would take them, so that kind of forced my hand. So right across the street from the church is our parochial school, grades K to 8, occupying the first 2 floors of the big concrete block building. The entire 3rd floor was the convent. And one evening I gathered the 8 nuns together, sat them down in their living room, and I said, hey, would you guys mind, moving out and we could turn the convent into a school for gang members? And they looked at each other and they went, sure. And that was the entirety of their discernment process. And we were off and running, and gang members came in large numbers from all 8 gangs. It was a tough school. I mean, we had like 3 brawls a day. I had to run across the street always. Teachers didn't last long. We had a principal who lasted exactly 1 day. I called him the next morning to see where the hell he was, and he apparently had changed his number and had checked himself into a witness protection program. But the kids, they came every day. And then they said, if only we had jobs. And so myself and the women in the parish, and the profile in the housing projects were women with children, not a lot of men. So myself and the women, we marched around the factories surrounding the housing projects, trying to find felony-friendly employers, and that wasn't so forthcoming. So we started things, maintenance crew, a landscaping crew, a crew to build our child care center, all made up of, all made up of members of the 8 gangs. And then in the last day of April, in 1992, after the acquittal of the 4 police officers who beat down Rodney King, every pocket of poverty just ignited in the whole city, except the poorest pocket, my parish. And so the LA Times wanted to know why that was, so they came to ask me questions. And I said, well, I'm not entirely sure, but I can say that we have 60 strategically hired rival gang members who have a reason to get up in the morning and a reason not to gangbang the night before, and more to the point of your question, a reason not to torch their own community. So the article appeared the next day. Well, the following day, I'm summoned to the Beverly Hills office of a movie producer named Ray Stark, who happened to have $500 million. And he looked at me and he said, how should I spend my money? And as I look back on it, I can see that I woefully undershot my request. I was young, I had hair, but I said, well, there's a bakery across the street from the school. You could buy it. It has ovens, they don't work, but you could fix them. I don't know, we could put hairnets on rival enemy gang members. They could, I suppose, bake bread, and we could call it Homeboy Bakery. And that was the extent of my business plan. And he said, sure, so we were off and running. A month later, we started Homeboy Tortillas in the Grand Central Market. Once we had plural, we changed our name from Jobs for a Future to Homeboy Industries. And now we're quite large. 10,000 gang members a year walk through our doors wanting to reimagine their lives. They come in and every single one is barricaded behind a wall of shame and disgrace, and the only thing that can scale that wall is tenderness. Every single one comes with what psychologists would call a disorganized attachment. Mom was either frightened or frightening. And you can't really calm yourself down if you've never been soothed. So we hope to soothe people, which is a good model for the moment in which we're currently living in our country. People think that what's happening is people hold different views, but I just think we're all held by the same anguish, which issues in the same invitation to soothe and walk each other home to wholeness. Every homie and homegirl who walks through those doors is welcomed, and people look at them and their whole being seems to say, you're here, you're here. And suddenly, for a very first time perhaps, they feel safe, and then they feel seen, and then they feel cherished. And if it's true that the traumatized are likely to cause trauma, it has to be equally true that the cherished will be able to find their way to the joy there is in cherishing themselves and others. Many years ago, I met a homie named Danny who was just 13 years old, and he, I knew him in the streets, and I would ride my bike in the middle of the night, and I would patrol the different parts of my parish and the 8 gangs. And I'd see Danny, and he always very slyly would lift his shirt to reveal that he had a gun tucked into the front of his pants. And then he'd let his shirt drop. And he made a solemn vow to me once. He said, "I will never step foot in Homeboy Industries." So I only knew him in the streets. I knew him at juvenile hall. I knew him in probation camps, detention facilities. Finally, at 18, he went to prison for 2 years. And in recovery, drug and alcohol and gang recovery, you would say it takes what it takes. For gang recovery, it's the birth of a son, the death of a friend, a long stretch in prison. For Danny, he got out of prison, and it takes what it takes. He discovered that his mom had 6 weeks to live, pancreatic cancer. And though he had a lot of siblings, he ended up being the designated hospice caregiver. And I remember going over there many times, and I watched how tender he was with her, all the more remarkable because she was quite torturous with him. I finally anointed her, and a week later, she died. A week after that, I buried her. And a week after that, Danny came into my office for the first time at Homeboy Industries. And I watch him inhabit the truth of who he is and discover his true self in loving. I watched him begin to know that loving is his home, and he stopped feeling homesick because of it. I watched him get his GED and work side by side with guys who he used to shoot at, because I remember. I watched him, as we say at Homeboy, laugh from the stomach. And one day he came into my office, and he began sort of dramatically. He said, "What happened to me yesterday has never happened to me in my whole life." And he tells me that he, at the end of the day at 5, he goes across the street to the Chinatown train stop to take the train east. He says that he gets on the train and it's very crowded, but he manages to get a seat. And standing right in front of him, holding onto a pole, he says, is a medio pedo guy, a guy who's a little bit drunk. He goes, he's a homie, older vato, I don't know who he is. He has tattoos on his hand. He's hanging onto the pole, and Danny is wearing a sweatshirt that says, Homeboy Industries, jobs, not jails. And the little bit drunk guy looks at Danny and he says, "You work there?" Danny doesn't know whether to engage him, so he just nods. "Is it any good?" And Danny shrugs and he says, "It's helped me. In fact, I don't think I'm going to ever go back to prison because of this place." And then Danny stands and he reaches into his pocket and he pulls out a piece of paper and he carefully writes the address of Homeboy Industries on the piece of paper. And as he's telling me this story, he says, "I couldn't believe I knew the address by heart." And he finishes writing the piece of paper and he sees this guy. And this guy sees Danny. And Danny hands him the piece of paper and he says, "You come see us. We'll help you." And the guy looks at Danny and he says, "Thank you." And the train stops and the guy gets off. And now Danny returns to his earlier refrain. What happened to me next has never happened to me in my life. Everyone on the train was staring at me. Everyone on the train was nodding at me. Everyone on the train was smiling at me. And now he can barely speak. And for the first time in my life, I felt admired. And that's the sound of God's dream come true. Kinship and connection. That's the sound of receiving the tender glance and then choosing to be that tender glance in the world. That's the sound of people nodding and smiling in unison as a way to shorten the darkness in which we find ourselves at the moment. So Homeboy has 14 social enterprises, and for 18 months, homies are engaged in healing, which is primary to everything else. We have free tattoo removal and therapy and classes and social enterprises from bakeries, restaurants, electronic recycling, silk screening, and dog grooming, which is our latest venture. At Homeboy, we're allergic to the idea of holding the bar up and asking homies to measure up, because our exhausted God never does that with us. Instead, we hold the mirror up and we tell people the truth, that they're exactly what God had in mind when God made them. And then you watch them become that truth and inhabit that truth, and no bullet can pierce it. No 4 prison walls can keep it out. And death can't touch it because it's huge. But you have to reach in and you have to dismantle those messages. Because otherwise people will believe something that is entirely untrue. And so we don't want to settle for a piety. We want to hold out for a holiness that tells the truth to each other and walks people home to their own health and wholeness. There's a passage in the Acts of the Apostles, and it says very simply, "And awe came upon everyone." And it suggests that the measure of health in every community, including this one, may well reside in our ability to stand in awe at what the poor have to carry, rather than stand in judgment at how they carry it. So many years ago, I was invited to speak to 600 social workers in Richmond, Virginia at a gang in-service, where social workers commandeer a hotel ballroom and they sign up and they get credits and they, workshops and breakout sessions and keynote addresses. And I had done a lot of these. And so I agreed to go, thinking I would do a keynote, so I bought my plane ticket. But a week before I was to fly, I pulled the letter out, and to my horror, I discovered that I am to be the only speaker from 9 to 5 all damn day. And I said to myself what the homies often say, "Oh, hell no, I'm not gonna be the only speaker." So I invited 2 trainees in, like these 2 characters, and Andre, an African-American gang member, and his enemy, Jose, and I sat them down, and they were like in their 9th month of their 18 months with us. And I said, "Look, at the end of the week, you're flying with me to Richmond, Virginia. I'd like you to get up in front of 600 social workers and tell your stories. Take your time." Because we got a long-ass day to fill. Well, I had never heard their stories before, and so Jose gets up first. He's like 25 years old, and gang member, shot caller, been to prison. At that juncture, everybody moves around with the trainees. They work here, they accompany there, they go to tattoo removal and work alongside the doctors. Or in his case, he kind of glommed onto the team of the substance use disorder group, and a man solid in his own recovery, and now he was helping younger homies and homegirls with their addiction issues. So not only was he shot caller from his gang and a gang member, he also had a long stretch as a homeless man, even longer stretch as a heroin addict. So he gets up in front of 600 social workers and he tells his story. I guess you could say my mom and me, we didn't get along so good. I think I was 6 when she looked at me and she said, "Why don't you just kill yourself? You're such a burden to me." And 600 social workers audibly gasped. And then he says, "It sounds way worser in Spanish." And we got whiplash going from gasp to laugh. But then he continued. I think I was 9 when my mom drove me down to the deepest part of Baja California, and she walks me up to an orphanage and she knocks on the door, and the guy comes to the door and she says, "I found this kid." And she left me there for 90 days until my grandmother could get out of her where she had dumped me, and my grandmother rescued me. My mom beat me every single day of my elementary school years with things you could imagine and a lot of things you couldn't. Every day my back was bloodied and scarred. In fact, I had to wear 3 t-shirts to school each day. First t-shirt because the blood would seep through. Second t-shirt, you could still see it. Finally, the third t-shirt, you couldn't see any blood. Kids at school, they'd make fun of me. "Hey, fool, it's 100 degrees. Why are you wearing 3 t-shirts?" And then he stopped speaking, so overwhelmed with emotion, and he seemed to be staring at a piece of his story that only he could see. And when he could regain his speech, he said through his tears, "I wore 3 t-shirts well into my adult years because I was ashamed of my wounds. I didn't want anybody to see them. But now I welcome my wounds. I run my fingers over my scars. My wounds are my friends. After all, how can I help heal the wounded if I don't welcome my own wounds?" And awe came upon everyone. The measure of your compassion as you leave this place is not in your service of those on the margins, but only in your willingness to see yourselves in kinship with them, like a bunch of strangers on a train, nodding and smiling. For the truth of the matter is this: if we don't welcome our own wounds, we may well be tempted to despise the wounded. And above all, we just want to take seriously what Jesus took seriously. We want to stay close to the marrow of the gospel. And fortunately for all of us, Jesus only took 4 things seriously: inclusion, nonviolence, unconditional loving kindness, and compassionate acceptance. That's what it looks like when we notice the notice of God and choose to be that notice in the world. That's what it looks like when we surrender into the arms of the God of love, then choose to be those arms. All right, last story. Because it's 5:30 in Los Angeles. This may come as a surprise to you, but sometimes, schools force their students to read my books against their will. I don't know if anybody's heard of that before. And I'm not complaining, but my alma mater, Gonzaga University in Spokane, who every March ruins my bracket, forced the incoming freshmen to read Tattoos on the Heart. And so they said, could you come and could you bring 2 homies with you? And I always bring homies when somebody says, bring them. I always choose homies, generally speaking, in the same way. I always pick enemies, rivals, just to force them to share a hotel room, just to mess with them. And I always pick homies who are terrified of flying just for the thrill of watching gang members panicked in the sky. And once I was at LAX and I had 2 older vatos who were there, and one of them said, hey, gee, are we flying Virgin Airlines because it's our first time? I said, yes, it's a requirement. We'll be coming home on American. So I picked 2 homies, Larry, an African-American gang member trainee, and Mario. And, I'm used to nervous Nellies. I do a lot of trips. I bring a lot of homies. I'm used to it. But, oh, my God, this guy, I've never seen anybody more terrified. And it was starting to freak me out a little bit. And, in fact, he was hyperventilating, which I'd never witnessed before, like that. And we hadn't even, boarded the plane yet. And we were at Burbank Airport, which is a small-ish airport, but big planes, Southwest Airlines. And they don't have you board the plane going through that hermetically sealed chute. You walk out onto the tarmac like you're the president. And they have the steps at the front of the plane, big feature at Burbank, steps at the back of the plane. And so I'm sitting there with Mario, and Larry is exploring the airport. And it's early morning, first flight of the day. It's still a little dark. And our flight crew arrives. I see them. And 2 female flight attendants, both with very large cups of Starbucks coffee, are schlepping up the steps to board the front of the plane. Just then, Mario goes, when are we going to board the plane? And I go, oh, as soon as they sober up the pilots. There they go now. Perhaps I should not have said that. Now, I should tell you that in our 37-year history as an organization, Mario, I think, is the most tattooed individual who works there, which is saying a lot. And he all sleeved out to his fingertips, neck blackened with the name of his gang, head shaved, covered in tattoos, forehead, cheeks, chin, eyelids that say the end, so that apparently when he's lying in his coffin, there will be no doubt for anybody. And so I'd never been in public with him, so I'm walking him through the airport to calm him down. And people are like, oh my God. And mothers are clutching their kids a little more closely. And I go, wow, isn't that interesting? Because if you were to go to Homeboy tomorrow and walk up to anybody who works there and say, who's the kindest, most gentle soul who works here? They would wait for one beat and they'd say, Mario. Am I right? Yeah, Mario. Mario is proof that only the soul that ventilates the world with tenderness has any chance of changing the world. He's proof of what they say, that the only non-delusional response to everything is kindness. So we get to Gonzaga, and much like the day that Pat had planned for us today, we had the big talk at night, but we had 93 class visits during the day. I know you're resembling this remark, but, and we were happy to do it. How about that? So, and so I told these 2 characters, I said, you get up and talk. I'm gonna sit in the back of the classroom and sip coffee. And they did. They got up at each of these classes, and they did a good job. Mario was in particular very nervous, but they told stories of terror and torture and violence and abuse of every imaginable kind. And honest to God, if their stories had been flames, you'd have to keep your distance, otherwise you'd get scorched. I would not have survived a single day of either of their childhoods. So that night came, Tuesday night, much like a venue like this, like 1,000 people. And they got up before me and told their stories again. And then I got up and I did my thing. And then we had a very brief kind of Q&A session, and they were standing on either side of me. And I was, yes, ma'am. And a woman stands and she goes, yeah, I got a question. It's for Mario. First question out the gate. And Mario's a tall, skinny drink of water, and he steps up to the microphone and he clutches it intensely, and he's just terrified. And he says, yes. And the woman says, well, Mario, you say you're a father and you have a son and a daughter. They're about to enter their teenage years. What wisdom do you impart to them? What advice do you give them? Mario closes his eyes and he's clutching the microphone with even greater intensity. And he's getting a friggin' hernia trying to come up with whatever the hell he's gonna say, when suddenly he blurts out just these two words, As soon as he says those two words, he rushes back to his microphone-clutching, closed-eyed refuge. But now I know he's losing his battle with his tears, but he wants to get the entire sentence out. I just don't want my kids to turn out to be like me. And there's silence until the woman who asked the question stands, and now it's her turn to cry. And she says, why wouldn't you want your kids to turn out to be like you? You are loving, you are kind, you are gentle, you are wise. I hope your kids turn out to be like you. And 1,000 total perfect strangers stand, and they will not stop clapping. And all Mario can do is hold his face in his hands, so overwhelmed that this room full of strangers had returned him to himself. And everyone standing had been returned to themselves. And I think that's the only praise our exhausted God has any interest in. And so today we surrender into the arms of the God of love. Then choose to be those arms. And this magnificent university is not the place you've come to. From the very beginning, it was to be the place you would go from, even if it's just this evening. And you go from here and you imagine a circle of compassion, and then you imagine nobody standing outside that circle. And you go from here precisely to dismantle the barriers that exclude. And you go from here to shorten the darkness in which we currently find ourselves, putting one loving foot in front of the next. Knowing that the only non-delusional response to everything is kindness. And my sense of you already is that you gave up a long time ago caring if anyone might accuse you of wasting your time at the margins. For in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing. Thank you very much.
Very impromptu, Father Boyle will be signing books over here. Thank you very much for coming this evening.